Let's go ahead and move on to this New York Times case. We've watched this with a lot of great interest because it has far-reaching implications in terms of the press, and probably contrary to where most of you will stand. We'll show you where we come out on this after we deliver the facts. Let's put this up there on the screen, which is that a judge is dismissing Sarah Palin's libel case against the New York Times. This was actually a very significant case because it actually went to trial, so much so that the jury continues to be in deliberations, and it went through the discovery process and more. Now, it all comes down to a 2017 editorial that ran in the New York Times editorial page called America's Lethal Politics. It was written by the editorial page. Now, that's very important because the editorial page speaks as the voice of the New York Times. So she's not suing a columnist, she's suing the New York Times itself. Inside that editorial, they drew a connection between what was at the time a link on Sarah Palin's website, which showed a map of different congressional districts with a bullseye on top of them. They linked that to the shooting on Congresswoman Gabby Giffords in 2011. Now, it later came out that the shooting had nothing to do with politics. It was just a complete crank.
Well, he was deeply
mentally ill. You know, there were all kinds of stuff that were going on there. But anyway, it had nothing to do with Sarah Palin's map. And actually, that was all litigated at the time in 2011. But then in 2017, there was an editorial on America's Lethal Politics. And in that editorial, they actually cited the Palin map as evidence for why that Gabby Giffords shooting took place. Clearly wrong, clearly defamatory, in my opinion, but was it libel? And the reason why is because the Palin would have to prove that the New York Times not only messed up in what they did, which they did, and they put a correction down at the article, she would have to prove that they acted with actual malice, the actual malice standard. And the judge, during the while the jury is deliberating, ruled that the Palin team did not rule the actual malice standard based upon evidence that James Bennett, who was the editorial director there, had testified within court that they did seek to try and change it, aka correct it. So the judge, by dismissing the case but allowing jury deliberations to continue, it's a bit complicated. He's basically saying, I as a judge find on the merits that this doesn't hold to scrutiny, but because this ultimately went to the jury, and this I know will go to the Court of Appeals, I'm gonna allow the jury to find their deliberations because that will matter in the appeals court. So it's a little bit complicated. Now, in terms of how I feel about it, I hate to say it, I don't like the New York Times, but I like press freedom a whole lot more, which is at the end of the day, we have the strongest rules to protect journalists and press institutions, including us here on Breaking Points, because of our First Amendment and our Constitution, that guarantees that the benefit of the doubt always goes to the media. And the reason why is because otherwise it would lead to not only frivolous lawsuits, but actions like during the Pentagon Papers and more to try and shut down publication of sensitive documents. That's why we've talked so much about why the standard on Julian Assange matters so much. And anybody who knows anything about press freedom knows how dangerous it is, that prosecution, to what it actually means to publish classified information. And here on this one, I gotta say it, I'm sorry, Sarah Palin. I think what they said about you was awful. It was completely wrong, but they corrected it. And a lot of people out there, oh, but people can lie with no consequences. Here's the consequence. Don't read them anymore. That's the consequence. Don't trust them. You shouldn't. And we'll tell you that here all day long. But from a press freedom perspective, Krystal, this is undoubtedly the best move. And the reason why being that while the New York Times and the editorial page has certainly wrought a lot of damage, and they were dead wrong here, the standard has to be set. They have to be able to prove that it had actual malice in order to libel your character, even if you do publish something which is completely wrong. The benefit of the doubt matters to the actual freedom of the press so that we can expose the people in power.
And the standard is higher when you're talking about a public figure.
Even so, more so than a public figure like
Sarah Palin. And part of why these rules and protections for journalists are important is because even the best journalists are going to screw something up.
That's exactly right.
Sometimes.
That's exactly right.
That is just the nature of the beast. And we try to be as careful and precise here as we possibly can be, but we're going to screw some things up from
I do
time
segments
to time.
about it.
Right, we do segments about it. We correct when we get things wrong. We try to be as meticulous as we can, but you can't do the job in constant fear that if you slip up or get something a little bit wrong or even a lot wrong, that you're going to be actually criminalized, that's going to cost you the job or cost the paper its ability to publish. Journalism wouldn't work if you had that kind of a stringent standard. This was one of the worst things that Trump would float, because he would float all the time, like changing the libel laws. It's an absolutely terrible idea. I will say, though, I did some digging here, and there were some interesting things that were revealed through this trial that gave some insights into the New York Times process. In particular, how this editorial came to be and how it came to have this extraordinarily inflammatory and ultimately completely wrong language about Sarah Palin. And it's basically a story of sort of like, lazy office workers. They had this piece they wanted to write about like gun control, and that didn't feel punchy enough. So they wanted to add this angle of inflammatory political rhetoric leading to violence. And the initial draft didn't do a really great job making that case, because it's a hard case to make. How do you draw the direct line between this inflammatory rhetoric and this violent action? So James Bennett steps in and says, all right, let me rework this draft. And he inserts in this language, ultimately totally incorrect language, that has the Sarah Palin, the famous targets over the district, and makes a direct connection to the shooting of Gabby Giffords in an effort to make it sexier and clickier and punchier. And so they publish this piece, and actually Ross Douthat sends an email and was like, this is wrong.
Yeah, he's like, this is completely wrong.
This is completely wrong. And so they start going back and forth and recognize that they have an issue. And they start talking to the fact checker. And at the piece published in the evening, and at 5:08 a.m., after like going back and forth all night over this piece, Bennett emails the initial author and the section's fact checker and writes, I don't know what the truth is here. And that was what the Palin team really seized on.
As the malice standard, yeah.
Right, exactly. That like they knew that this wasn't really correct. And it took some time later before, it's pulled from the piece, correction is written, an apology actually went out, which is against Times policy, but they felt like it was an egregious enough mistake that they needed to actually directly apologize to Sarah Palin, which was also offered as evidence against the idea that there was actual malice here.
Yeah, and I think that's correct.
But it does show you how sloppy they are. That the motivation here wasn't let me get this correct. The motivation was let me get clicks and traffic and punch this up and make it sexier. Even though he admits here, I don't actually know what the truth is.
There you go.
I thought that was interesting.
And there's your takeaway, everyone. There's a lot of people who listen to the show. You should listen to that, and you should be like, hey, don't listen to the New York Times. Or like whenever you read the New York Times editorial page, you should try and fact check a lot of these things ourselves. We do it too. So, and anytime we use the Times reporting, usually it's just for the headline in order to show it kind of in its starkness. But we'll go and check and make sure that what this is showing, et cetera. And that's part of the problem. We live in an individualized age where you have to have deep lack of trust, and you have to be able to go through and think a lot for yourself. But at the end of the day, press freedom is what matters more than anything else. Not just about this show, it's about every show, about any independent journalist out there. Because look, if push comes to shove, it ain't them that will actually be paying the price. It will be all of us, the much, 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 much smaller players who don't have as much money, who don't have the same support.
To have lawyers fight this out for us in court the way that they do.
Exactly. So if this show was in the UK or somewhere else, for example, where they don't have true freedom of speech and something like this happens, you're dead. And I don't think that's the right standard.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.